The email was already composed when Marcus told me I had no work ethic. I had been watching him for months, documenting his decisions, cataloging his failures. The irony of his accusation, delivered while I sat at my desk at 11 p.m. on a Friday night, reviewing code that should have been completed weeks ago under his leadership, was not lost on me. These things happen in corporate environments. People mistake visible presence for actual contribution. Marcus had been promoted to team lead 8 months earlier, a decision that surprised exactly no one who understood how corporate hierarchies actually function. He possessed that particular combination of confidence and superficial knowledge that middle management finds irresistible. His technical background was adequate, his presentation skills polished, and his ability to deflect responsibility onto subordinates was frankly impressive. I had worked under more competent leaders, but I had also worked under far worse ones. The project we were attempting to salvage was a customer relationship management system for a Fortune 500 manufacturing client. The contract was worth approximately $12 million to our consulting firm, with potential for additional phases that could double that amount. Marcus had inherited the project from our previous lead, who had been promoted to a different division after successfully establishing the initial architecture and requirements gathering phase. Everything had been progressing smoothly until Marcus decided the existing approach was insufficiently innovative. I should provide some context about my role in this situation. I had been with the firm for 7 years, specializing in enterprise software integration and database optimization. My technical certifications were current, my client feedback consistently positive, and my track record included 3 major implementations that had been delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. I was not the most senior developer on the team, but I was arguably the most experienced with the specific technology stack we were using for this project. Marcus announced his vision for revolutionizing our approach during a team meeting in early February. Rather than following the established integration patterns that had proven successful in similar implementations, he wanted to experiment with a new architectural framework that promised better scalability and performance. The framework was cutting edge, he explained, and implementing it successfully would position our team as thought leaders in the industry. The concerns I raised about timeline and complexity were acknowledged with the kind of patient condescension typically reserved for children who ask too many questions. Marcus assured the team that his previous experience with similar frameworks would accelerate our development process. The fact that his previous experience consisted of a single proof-of-concept project that had never reached production deployment was information he chose not to share at that time. By March, it became clear that the revolutionary framework was not cooperating with our requirements. Integration points that should have been straightforward were requiring extensive custom development. Performance benchmarks were falling short of client expectations. The database optimization strategies I had recommended were being overridden by architectural constraints imposed by the new framework. I began working additional hours to compensate for the mounting technical debt, staying late to research alternative approaches and test potential solutions. Marcus interpreted my extended presence in the office as evidence of inefficient time management. During our weekly one-on-one meetings, he would comment on my apparent inability to complete tasks within normal business hours. He suggested that I consider taking project management courses to improve my planning skills. The irony of receiving time management advice from someone whose architectural decisions had doubled our development timeline was not something I felt compelled to point out at the time. The client began expressing concerns in April. Their preliminary user acceptance testing had revealed significant performance issues and several critical functionality gaps. The system was taking nearly 30 seconds to generate reports that their existing legacy system could produce in under 5 seconds. Data synchronization between modules was failing intermittently, requiring manual intervention to maintain consistency. These were not minor bugs that could be addressed with routine patches. These were fundamental architectural problems that would require substantial rework to resolve. Marcus responded to the client feedback by scheduling additional meetings to clarify requirements and adjust expectations. He assured them that the performance issues were temporary and would be resolved through optimization passes in subsequent development cycles. He did not mention that the optimization strategies I had proposed were incompatible with the framework he had selected, or that implementing meaningful performance improvements would require abandoning months of development work. I began documenting these conversations and decisions with increased attention to detail. Email threads were saved with complete headers and timestamps. Meeting notes included exact quotes and specific technical recommendations. Project status reports were archived with version control information and deployment history. This was not initially intended as preparation for any particular action. It was simply a professional habit developed over years of working in environments where accountability could become unexpectedly important. The situation deteriorated significantly in May when the client threatened to terminate the contract if substantial improvements were not demonstrated within 30 days. Their executives had lost confidence in our ability to deliver a functional system, and their IT department was advocating for bringing the development work in-house rather than continuing with our consulting arrangement. The potential loss of revenue would have serious implications for our quarterly projections and could impact the annual performance reviews of everyone associated with the project. Marcus convened an emergency planning session to address the crisis. His solution involved requesting additional developers from other projects, extending the timeline by 3 months, and increasing the project budget by approximately 40%. He assured the team that these measures would provide sufficient resources to resolve the outstanding issues and deliver a system that exceeded the client's original expectations. I had been preparing a different recommendation. Working through several weekends, I had developed a detailed migration plan that would transition the existing work to a more conventional architectural approach. The plan required abandoning the experimental framework in favor of proven integration patterns, but it would preserve approximately 60% of the existing code base and could be completed within the original timeline. The performance benchmarks I had calculated suggested the revised system would meet or exceed all client requirements while maintaining the scalability they had requested. Marcus dismissed this alternative without serious consideration. He explained that abandoning the innovative framework would represent a failure of technical leadership and would damage our reputation as forward-thinking consultants. He was not interested in retreating to outdated approaches when the current challenges could be overcome through additional effort and resources. This was the point at which my work schedule expanded to 70 hours per week. Marcus had made it clear that the experimental framework was non-negotiable, which meant that every performance optimization would need to be achieved through creative workarounds and custom implementations. The database queries required hand-tuning to compensate for inefficient object relational mapping. The user interface needed additional caching layers to provide acceptable response times. Integration points required custom adapters to bridge incompatible API specifications. I was not the only team member working extended hours, but I was certainly the most persistent. Junior developers would burn out after a few weeks of sustained overtime and would scale back to more reasonable schedules. Senior developers had families and personal commitments that limited their availability for extended work sessions. I had fewer external obligations and a stronger personal investment in the project's success, so I continued working nights and weekends while others found ways to manage their workload within conventional boundaries. Marcus began making comments about my work habits during team meetings in June. He would arrive at the office around 9 a.m. and observe that I was already at my desk, then comment that I must not have much of a personal life outside of work. When he left for the day around 6 p.m. and found me still coding, he would suggest that I was probably not being as productive as I could be if I needed to work such long hours to complete my assignments. These observations were delivered with a tone of concerned mentorship, as if he was genuinely worried about my work-life balance and professional development. The rest of the team would respond with awkward silence or forced laughter, recognizing the implicit criticism but not wanting to directly challenge the team lead's assessment. I would acknowledge his comments with non-committal responses and continue working. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late June. I had been analyzing performance metrics from our latest deployment when I identified a specific optimization that could improve system response times by approximately 70%. The solution required modifying the database schema and implementing a custom indexing strategy, but the changes were relatively straightforward and could be completed over a weekend. I implemented the optimization during Saturday and Sunday, testing thoroughly to ensure compatibility with all existing functionality. The performance improvements were even better than my calculations had predicted, with most operations completing in under 3 seconds and complex reports generating in less than 10 seconds. This was approaching the performance level of the client's existing legacy system while providing significantly enhanced functionality. Monday morning brought the usual team status meeting, where Marcus would review progress and assign priorities for the upcoming week. I presented the performance optimization results, demonstrating the improved response times and explaining the technical approach I had used. The team was impressed with the dramatic improvement, and several members asked detailed questions about the implementation methodology. Marcus acknowledged the optimization work but expressed concern about unauthorized modifications to the database schema. He explained that changes of this magnitude should have been reviewed by the architecture team before implementation, and that deploying untested modifications could introduce stability risks that might not become apparent until after the system went into production use. I clarified that the modifications had been thoroughly tested and that all existing functionality remained intact. I had also prepared rollback procedures in case any unexpected issues were discovered during subsequent testing phases. The optimization was implemented using standard database features and did not require any experimental or unsupported techniques. Marcus remained concerned about the precedent of individual developers making significant architectural decisions without proper authorization. He directed me to document the changes for review by the architecture team and to avoid implementing similar modifications without explicit approval in the future. The optimization would remain in place for the current testing cycle, but future performance improvements would need to follow established change management procedures. This response was illuminating in several ways. Marcus was essentially criticizing me for successfully solving the most critical problem facing our project, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge that his architectural decisions had created the need for such workarounds in the first place. He was more concerned about maintaining control over technical decisions than about delivering functional software to our client. The client's response to the performance improvements was overwhelmingly positive. Their testing team reported that the system was now meeting their response time requirements and that the stability issues they had been experiencing were no longer occurring. They requested a demonstration of the optimization techniques for their internal development team and asked whether similar improvements could be implemented in other areas of the system. Marcus scheduled a client presentation for the following week, during which he would explain the innovative optimization strategies that our team had developed to address their performance requirements. He spent considerable time preparing slides that highlighted the technical sophistication of our approach and the collaborative effort that had made the improvements possible. My specific contributions were mentioned in the context of implementation details, but the overall narrative focused on the team's collective achievement under his leadership. The presentation was successful in the sense that the client was satisfied with our progress and agreed to continue with the original project timeline. However, their technical team asked several detailed questions about the optimization methodology that Marcus was unable to answer without referring to my documentation. It became apparent that he did not fully understand the techniques I had implemented, despite taking credit for the strategic decision to pursue this approach. Following the client presentation, Marcus called a team meeting to discuss lessons learned from the optimization project. He emphasized the importance of collaborative problem-solving and noted that individual contributors could achieve remarkable results when properly guided by experienced technical leadership. He also reminded the team that all significant technical decisions should be coordinated through appropriate channels to ensure consistency with overall architectural goals. I was beginning to understand that Marcus viewed my technical contributions as both essential for project success and threatening to his authority as team lead. He needed my expertise to solve the problems created by his architectural decisions, but he could not acknowledge this dependency without undermining his credibility as a leader. This created a dynamic where my most valuable work would be simultaneously celebrated and minimized, credited to team success while being attributed to his guidance. The pattern continued through July and August as additional optimization challenges emerged. Each time I would identify and resolve a critical issue, working extended hours to develop solutions that kept the project on track. Marcus would present these achievements to stakeholders while expressing private concerns about my methods or questioning whether the solutions were sustainable for long-term maintenance. By September, I was consistently working 70 to 75 hours per week. The client had requested additional functionality that would require significant database modifications and API enhancements. Marcus had committed to delivering these features within the original timeline, despite the fact that our development velocity had already been compromised by the architectural challenges we were still resolving. The additional work fell primarily to me because I was the only team member with sufficient expertise in both the database optimization techniques and the custom integration patterns we had been forced to develop. Junior developers could handle routine coding tasks, but the complex problem-solving required for this type of work was beyond their current skill level. Senior developers were focused on other aspects of the project and did not have the detailed knowledge of our custom implementations that would be necessary for effective contributions. Marcus began making increasingly pointed comments about my work schedule during this period. He would observe that I seemed to be struggling with time management and suggest that I might benefit from delegating some responsibilities to other team members. When I explained that the work required specialized knowledge that other team members did not possess, he would respond that effective technical professionals should be able to transfer knowledge and build team capabilities rather than creating dependencies on individual expertise. These conversations were frustrating because they ignored the fundamental reality of our situation. Marcus had created a technical environment that required specialized expertise to navigate, then criticized me for developing that expertise and applying it to solve the problems he had created. He wanted the benefits of my technical contributions without acknowledging the circumstances that made those contributions necessary. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in late September. I had been working since 7 a.m. to resolve a critical integration issue that was preventing the client from conducting their scheduled user acceptance testing. The problem required analyzing log files from multiple systems and tracing data flow through several custom adapters to identify where the synchronization was failing. I had finally isolated the issue to a race condition in one of the API calls, where rapid successive requests could cause data corruption under specific timing conditions. The solution required implementing a queuing mechanism with proper transaction management, which meant modifying both the client interface and the back-end processing logic. It was complex work that required careful attention to detail and thorough testing to ensure that the fix did not introduce additional problems. Marcus arrived at the office around 6 p.m. as I was completing the final testing of the fix. He observed that I was still working and commented that it was concerning how often I seemed to require extended hours to complete my assignments. He suggested that perhaps I was not being efficient with my time during normal business hours, or that I was taking on more work than I could reasonably handle within a standard schedule. I explained that I was resolving a critical issue that would prevent the client from conducting their testing if it were not fixed before Monday morning. The problem had been discovered that afternoon during their preparation activities, and delaying the fix would mean postponing their testing cycle by at least a week. Given the tight timeline we were already working within, such a delay could jeopardize our ability to meet the final delivery date. Marcus acknowledged the urgency of the situation, but maintained that consistent overtime was not a sustainable approach to project management. He suggested that in the future, we should identify potential issues earlier in the development cycle so that they could be addressed during normal working hours. He also noted that relying on individual team members to work excessive hours created risks for project continuity and was not fair to other team members who were maintaining healthier work-life balance. This was the conversation that clarified the fundamental disconnect between Marcus's perspective and the reality of our project situation. He was essentially criticizing me for working the hours necessary to keep his project successful, while refusing to acknowledge that his architectural decisions had created the need for this level of individual effort. He wanted me to somehow anticipate and prevent problems that were inherent in the experimental framework he had insisted on using, while also maintaining a conventional work schedule that would be appropriate for a more straightforward implementation. I completed the integration fix that evening and deployed it to the testing environment. The client was able to proceed with their user acceptance testing on Monday morning, and the system performed without any of the synchronization issues they had been experiencing. They sent positive feedback about the reliability improvements and requested additional information about our quality assurance processes. Marcus forwarded the client feedback to our project stakeholders, with commentary highlighting our team's commitment to quality and our proactive approach to problem resolution. He scheduled a brief team meeting to share the positive client response and to reinforce the importance of maintaining high standards throughout the remaining development phases. During the team meeting, Marcus made several references to the collaborative effort that had made the successful fix possible and noted that projects of this complexity require coordinated teamwork rather than individual heroics. He emphasized that sustainable development practices were essential for long-term project success, and that teams performed best when all members contributed consistently rather than relying on sporadic bursts of overtime work from specific individuals. I was beginning to understand that Marcus had developed a narrative about our project that positioned him as a strategic leader managing a collaborative team effort while simultaneously relying on my individual contributions to solve the most critical technical challenges. This narrative required minimizing the significance of my specific expertise and portraying the extraordinary time investment I was making as evidence of poor planning or inefficient work habits. October brought additional challenges as we approached the final integration phase. The client had requested several last-minute modifications to accommodate changes in their business requirements, and Marcus had agreed to implement these changes without adjusting the timeline or budget. The modifications required substantial revisions to the database schema and significant changes to the user interface components. I was assigned primary responsibility for implementing these changes because of my familiarity with the optimization techniques and custom integration patterns that would be affected. The work required careful coordination between multiple system components and thorough testing to ensure that the modifications did not compromise the performance improvements we had achieved in previous phases. The timeline for completing these modifications was extremely aggressive, requiring approximately 2 weeks of work to be completed in 8 days. I began working 12-hour days and coming in on weekends to maintain the schedule that Marcus had committed to. Other team members were also working additional hours, but their contributions were focused on less critical aspects of the implementation that could be delayed if necessary without impacting the overall delivery date. Marcus continued to express concern about my work schedule during this period, but his comments took on a different tone. Rather than suggesting that I was inefficient or poorly organized, he began implying that I was working excessive hours because I enjoyed the attention and recognition that came from being perceived as indispensable. He suggested that I might be creating unnecessary complexity in my work to justify the time I was spending on it. These observations were particularly revealing because they indicated that Marcus understood exactly how dependent the project's success was on my individual contributions, but he was uncomfortable with this dependency and was attempting to reframe it as a character flaw on my part. He needed me to continue working the extended hours necessary to meet his commitments, but he also needed to maintain the illusion that such efforts were not actually required for project success. The final modifications were completed on schedule, and the client conducted their final acceptance testing without identifying any significant issues. The system met all performance requirements and included all requested functionality. The client's project manager sent formal notification that they were satisfied with the deliverable and were prepared to proceed with the deployment to their production environment. Marcus scheduled a project wrap-up meeting to review lessons learned and celebrate the successful completion of a challenging implementation. He prepared a presentation highlighting the innovative technical approaches that had been developed during the project and the collaborative problem-solving that had enabled the team to overcome significant obstacles. During the presentation, Marcus described the optimization work as an example of how experienced leadership could guide talented developers toward creative solutions that might not have been obvious through conventional approaches. He characterized the extended work hours as evidence of the team's commitment to excellence and noted that exceptional results often require exceptional effort from dedicated professionals. I sat through this presentation with growing clarity about the dynamics that had shaped the previous 10 months. Marcus had created a situation where my technical expertise was essential for project success, then developed a narrative that attributed that success to his leadership while minimizing my individual contributions. He had committed to aggressive timelines that required extraordinary individual effort, then criticized that effort as evidence of poor planning or inefficient work habits. The project was completed successfully, the client was satisfied, and the contract was renewed for additional phases. Marcus received recognition from senior management for his leadership of a challenging implementation and was considered for promotion to a senior consulting role. I received positive performance feedback and a standard merit increase that was consistent with my experience level and role within the organization. This outcome would have been acceptable if it represented an accurate assessment of our respective contributions to the project's success. However, I had documented enough information throughout the implementation process to understand exactly how the work had been distributed and how the critical decisions had been made. Marcus had taken credit for successes that resulted directly from technical expertise he did not possess, and had deflected responsibility for problems that resulted from his architectural decisions. The documentation I had been maintaining throughout the project included detailed records of technical recommendations, implementation decisions, problem resolution activities, and time allocation across different project phases. I had email threads showing Marcus's resistance to performance optimization strategies that ultimately proved essential for meeting client requirements. I had meeting notes documenting his commitment to timelines that required extraordinary individual effort while simultaneously criticizing that effort as unprofessional. Most importantly, I had quantitative data showing the direct relationship between my individual contributions and the project's key successes. The performance optimizations that had saved the client relationship were my individual work, completed during extended hours that Marcus had characterized as evidence of poor time management. The critical bug fixes that had enabled on-schedule delivery were my individual work, completed during weekends that Marcus had described as unsustainable and unnecessary. I began composing the email to the executive team on a Sunday evening in November. The decision was not made impulsively or emotionally, but rather represented a calculated assessment of the situation and a determination that accurate information should be available to decision-makers who were evaluating Marcus for advancement opportunities. The email was structured as a detailed project retrospective, providing quantitative analysis of technical decisions, timeline management, and resource allocation throughout the implementation. I included specific examples of architectural choices that had created unnecessary complexity and timeline pressure, along with documentation of alternative approaches that had been proposed and dismissed. I provided detailed breakdowns of individual contributions to critical project milestones, with supporting evidence from code repositories, deployment logs, and client feedback. The tone of the email was professional and analytical rather than accusatory or emotional. I presented information objectively and allowed the recipients to draw their own conclusions about leadership effectiveness and individual performance. I did not request any specific action or suggest any particular personnel decisions. I simply provided comprehensive documentation of how the project had actually been managed and completed. I included attachments with relevant email threads, meeting notes, technical specifications, and performance metrics. The documentation was extensive enough to support independent verification of any claims made in the email, and I had organized it to facilitate review by executives who might not have detailed technical knowledge but would understand the business implications of the decisions described. The email was sent to the senior partner responsible for our consulting division, the practice manager who oversaw technical implementations, and the human resources director who managed performance evaluations for our team. I also copied the project sponsor who had been responsible for client relationship management throughout the implementation. Marcus was not copied on the email, nor was anyone else from our immediate team. This was not intended as a public accusation or an attempt to embarrass anyone in front of their colleagues. It was intended as confidential communication to decision-makers who had both the authority and the responsibility to evaluate the information objectively. The response was swift and comprehensive. I received a request to meet with the senior partner on Tuesday morning to discuss the project retrospective in detail. Marcus was asked to attend a separate meeting that same afternoon to provide his perspective on the implementation process and to address some questions about project management decisions. During my meeting with the senior partner, I was asked to elaborate on specific technical decisions and to provide additional context for some of the timeline and resource allocation issues described in my email. The questions were thorough and indicated that the email had been reviewed carefully by someone with sufficient technical knowledge to understand the implications of the decisions documented. I was also asked about my perspective on team dynamics and whether I felt that concerns about project management could have been addressed through different communication channels. I explained that I had raised technical concerns throughout the implementation process, but that alternative approaches had been consistently dismissed without serious consideration. I noted that I had not previously escalated these concerns because the project had been completed successfully and the client was satisfied with the results. The senior partner acknowledged that project success had indeed been achieved, but noted that the methods used to achieve that success were relevant for evaluating team leadership and for making decisions about future project assignments. He indicated that my documentation would be reviewed thoroughly and that appropriate follow-up actions would be determined based on that review. Marcus's meeting that afternoon lasted considerably longer than my morning session. I observed him entering the conference room with a folder of what appeared to be his own documentation, and I noticed that he remained in the meeting for nearly 3 hours. Other team members began speculating about the purpose of the extended discussion, but I maintained my normal work routine and did not engage in speculation about personnel matters. The investigation that followed was discreet but thorough. Other team members were interviewed individually about their experiences during the project implementation. Client feedback was reviewed in detail, with particular attention to technical issues and timeline challenges that had been encountered. Code repositories were analyzed to determine individual contributions to critical project components. Marcus's behavior during this period became increasingly defensive and erratic. He began questioning team members about their conversations with management and suggesting that external criticism of the project represented unfair attacks on the team's collective achievements. He also began making pointed comments about loyalty and professional integrity, implying that team members had an obligation to support their colleagues rather than undermining them with outside parties. These reactions provided additional evidence of Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of professional accountability. He appeared to view objective documentation of project management decisions as personal betrayal rather than legitimate business information. He seemed to believe that team loyalty required concealing management failures rather than ensuring that accurate information was available to decision-makers. The results of the investigation became apparent in December, when Marcus was reassigned to a different role within the organization. The reassignment was described as a lateral move that would allow him to focus on strategic planning rather than direct project management. He would no longer be responsible for technical implementations or team leadership, but would instead support business development activities and client relationship management. Marcus's reaction to this reassignment was to submit his resignation, effective at the end of the calendar year. He explained that he had been offered an opportunity with a different consulting firm that would better utilize his strategic thinking capabilities and leadership experience. He characterized his departure as a positive career move rather than a response to any organizational concerns about his performance. The team was informed that I would be serving as interim technical lead for ongoing project phases, while a permanent replacement was identified. This appointment was accompanied by a significant salary increase and formal recognition for my contributions to the successful completion of the previous implementation phase. I was also asked to develop recommendations for improving project management processes and technical decision-making protocols. Marcus's final weeks with the organization were marked by continued attempts to control the narrative about his departure. He spoke frequently about the exciting opportunities he would have in his new position and the limitations he had experienced in his current role. He characterized his resignation as evidence of his ambition and professional growth rather than as the consequence of management concerns about his leadership effectiveness. The irony of Marcus's situation was that he had indeed been a victim of his own leadership approach. His tendency to take credit for successes while deflecting responsibility for problems had created a documented record of management decisions that could not withstand objective analysis. His habit of criticizing subordinates for working the hours necessary to compensate for his poor planning had created resentment that motivated detailed documentation of actual work allocation and individual contributions. Marcus had built his leadership style around maintaining plausible deniability for problems while claiming credit for solutions. This approach had been sustainable when his performance was evaluated based on subjective impressions and political relationships rather than objective analysis of results. However, when detailed documentation became available that revealed the actual distribution of work and responsibility, his narrative of collaborative leadership under strategic guidance became impossible to maintain. The transition to new project leadership proceeded smoothly because the technical architecture and team dynamics had been thoroughly documented throughout the previous implementation. The new technical lead was able to understand both the successful optimization strategies and the problematic architectural decisions that had created unnecessary complexity. This enabled informed decision-making about future development approaches and helped avoid repeating the mistakes that had made the previous implementation so challenging. Looking back on this experience several months later, I recognize that the most significant outcome was not Marcus's departure from the organization, but rather the establishment of more transparent accountability for project management decisions. The documentation practices I had developed for my own protection became standard procedures for technical implementations, ensuring that future project evaluations would be based on objective evidence rather than subjective impressions. The client relationship that Marcus had jeopardized through his architectural experimentation was strengthened through subsequent project phases that delivered consistent results without requiring extraordinary individual effort. The performance optimization techniques that I had developed to compensate for his poor planning became standard approaches that improved efficiency across multiple implementations. Marcus's new position with the competing consulting firm did not prove to be the career advancement he had anticipated. Within 6 months, he had been moved to a business development role with no direct project responsibilities. Within a year, he had left that organization as well and was working as an independent contractor specializing in project planning and strategic consulting. These subsequent developments confirmed that the problems Marcus had experienced in our organization were not the result of organizational limitations or political dynamics, but rather reflected fundamental weaknesses in his approach to technical leadership. His pattern of overcommitting on timelines, underinvesting in technical planning, and deflecting accountability for problems was not sustainable in environments where objective performance evaluation was possible. The professional vindication I experienced was not the dramatic confrontation or public humiliation that characterizes fictional revenge narratives. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing merit recognized and accountability established through systematic documentation and objective analysis. The most rewarding aspect was not Marcus's departure, but rather the implementation of more transparent evaluation processes that would prevent similar situations in the future. The 70-hour workweeks had been an investment in both project success and professional credibility. The extensive documentation had been preparation for conversations I hoped would never be necessary. The patient endurance of criticism and condescension had been the price of maintaining access to information that would ultimately prove decisive. Marcus had taught me that technical competence alone is not sufficient for professional success in environments where political dynamics and narrative control can override objective performance evaluation. However, he had also demonstrated that sustainable career advancement requires genuine competence and ethical decision-making that can withstand detailed scrutiny when accountability becomes unavoidable. The email that ended Marcus's career was not an act of revenge, but rather an exercise in professional responsibility. Decision-makers who were evaluating his suitability for advancement had a right to accurate information about his leadership effectiveness and technical judgment. The organization had a right to understand how its most challenging projects were actually being completed and what resources were required for future success. The 70-hour workweeks had been necessary to save Marcus's project, but they had also provided the detailed knowledge and documented evidence that revealed the true nature of his leadership. His mockery of my work ethic had been intended to deflect attention from his own failures, but it had instead highlighted the disconnect between his narrative and the reality of our project management. In professional environments, sustainable success requires aligning perception with reality rather than substituting narrative for performance. Marcus had built his career on the premise that managing impressions was more important than managing projects, and that controlling conversations was more valuable than controlling outcomes. This approach had worked temporarily, but it could not survive systematic documentation and objective analysis. The ultimate lesson from this experience was not about the importance of revenge or the satisfaction of seeing incompetent leaders fail. It was about the value of maintaining professional integrity, documenting actual performance, and ensuring that decision-makers have access to accurate information when evaluating leadership effectiveness and making personnel decisions that affect entire teams and client relationships. Marcus's departure created opportunities for more competent leadership and more transparent accountability. The project management improvements that resulted from this experience benefited subsequent implementations and strengthened client relationships. The recognition of individual technical contributions improved team morale and encouraged continued professional development. These positive outcomes were the real vindication, not Marcus's career difficulties, but rather the improvements in organizational effectiveness that resulted from establishing more accurate performance evaluation and more equitable recognition of individual contributions. The 70-hour work weeks had been an investment that ultimately paid dividends not just for my own career advancement, but for the improved management of future projects and the enhanced reputation of our consulting practice. The email had been composed with the understanding that professional environments function most effectively when decisions are based on accurate information rather than managed perceptions. Marcus had spent months constructing a narrative that attributed project success to his strategic leadership while minimizing the individual contributions that had actually made that success possible. The documentation I provided offered an alternative perspective based on quantitative evidence and objective analysis. The decision-makers who received that email were able to evaluate Marcus's leadership effectiveness using information that had not been available through normal reporting channels. This enabled more informed decisions about project assignments, promotion opportunities, and resource allocation for future implementations. The professional vindication was ultimately about the establishment of merit-based evaluation rather than the punishment of incompetent leadership. Marcus's departure was a consequence of his own decisions and management style, not the result of any coordinated effort to undermine his career. The documentation simply provided transparency about decisions and contributions that had previously been obscured by political dynamics and narrative management. The 70-hour work weeks had been necessary to maintain project success under challenging circumstances, but they had also provided detailed knowledge of technical implementation and project management that proved valuable for both immediate problem-solving and long-term organizational improvement. The criticism I received for working those hours had been intended to deflect attention from the circumstances that made such hours necessary, but it had instead highlighted the disconnect between rhetoric and reality in our project management approach. Looking back on this experience, I recognize that the most significant professional development was not learning to navigate political dynamics or manage difficult personalities, but rather understanding the importance of systematic documentation and objective performance evaluation in maintaining accountability and recognizing merit in complex organizational environments.